Do you want to become a talk show host? Do you have a great idea? Passionate World Talk Radio is currently looking for podcast hosts for our internet talk radio station. Please email us at pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com with your name, email address, cell phone number, and podcast topic. In return, you will receive a 3-minute intro on air to a live audience about your podcast. Remember, just email us your name, email address, and your podcast topic, and in return, you will receive a free 3-minute intro on the air. How cool is that? Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain.
This show does not provide medical advice. If you're having a medical emergency, please call 911. Anything you hear here should be discussed with your primary healthcare provider. Hello and welcome to Everyone Dies, the radio show produced by Passionate World Talk Radio, whose goal it is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. I'm Marianne Matzo, and for the next 30 minutes, I am your host. Well, I am thrilled today to have on our show Dr. Ken Doka. Now, those of you who are in, the healthcare field, I know you know his name, and I know you've read his articles, and I know maybe even you've listened to his various shows that he's done with the National Hospice Foundation of America, the teleconferences that he's been doing since 1994. He's a retired professor from the College of New Rochelle, is a licensed medical health counselor and a certified grief counselor. And seriously, for me, if I think about, who knows the most about grief, it's Dr. Doka, really. He's been doing this for an extremely long time and is just has a really good, kind understanding about this issue. So welcome, Dr. Doka.
Welcome. And may I make just a couple of corrections?
Absolutely.
It's the Hospice Foundation of America that does the teleconferences rather than it's the Hospice Foundation of America. And I'm a licensed mental health counselor, not medical health counselor, but mental health counselor.
Oh, it must be my accent, because that's what I wrote down, or either that or I can't read anymore.
Well, just to make it clear.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I was talking with Dr. Doka and saying that one of the issues that I find difficult personally to help people work through is the sudden loss of a child. And, there is a difference between, if your child's been sick and you've got a period of time to be thinking about, my child is sick, they could possibly die. You see the changes in your child. That's different. It's still a loss. It's still a horrible loss of your child, but it's a different kind of loss than if your child's going to run out to the store and is killed in a car accident, or they go out with their friends and there's gunfire and they're dead, or you put your baby down for a nap and she's dead when you go in to pick her up. Would you agree with that, Dr. Doka?
Oh, I think in our society right now, the death of a child is extremely traumatic because at least in most populations, and as you said, in some communities there's a lot of violence where you pray that your child's going to survive, but most of us accept that our child's going to survive to adulthood. And that's really, if you think about it, a relatively new experience. Up until the beginning of, maybe if you go back 100 years ago, that was not the normal scope of things. We didn't expect all of our children to live. I remember, if you have time for a small anecdote, when I first started getting involved in this field, which was 50 years ago, I was talking with my mother about my work with dying children, and we call this a family bomb, where all of a sudden something's dropped on you that you never knew before, and that you think you should have known. And all of a sudden my mother said to me, "Oh, did I ever tell you that I had a brother who died?" And I said, "No, that should have come up in 20-something years, you would think." And she said, "Well, I really didn't know him. I was now remember, my mother was born in the early 1900s, about 100 years ago, and my mother said, I didn't really know him. He died of diphtheria when I was 2. He was 4." And so I went to my grandmother, a lovely Hispanic woman who was born in the in the 1800s, mid 1800s, and I said to her, I said, "Grandma, I said, I understand. I had an uncle who died, Uncle Juan." And my grandmother smiled at me and said, "Oh yes, I was very lucky. I had 6 children, and 5 of them survived to adulthood." I'm sure you won't hear these from parents today, but that was, in her culture and her society, to have all your children survive was pretty remarkable. That's not the case now, obviously, and so we have a whole different reaction to it. And I think it is a very, very traumatic loss for most people. We do not expect our children to predecease us.
Right. That screws up the natural order of things, right?
Yeah, and even if that child dies not from something sudden, but from any cause, we just don't expect. We may have more preparation if we know our child has some kind of disease, but we never expect the death when it occurs.
So, what do you say to parents who have experienced the sudden death of their child? What kinds of counseling do you do in that situation?
Well, it's like any counseling. You address with them what they're struggling with and what their issues are. You have no answers. You have no, you can't give a reason, and that's what parents desperately want, is something to understand. So you have to just be sort of, holding them through the process as they explore what this loss means to them and how they're going to deal with it.
So I've seen, different Facebook groups about, the death of their children, and people posting about, I don't want to live anymore. I want to go into the grave too. And it's like this grief is so profound. Are there strategies for those parents in terms of working or pulling themselves out? I don't even know if that's the right term.
Yeah, certainly, for example, because it's such a traumatic and shattering event, the first thing I would do is assess, are they seriously at risk for suicide? Are they experiencing depression? And then, if that's the case, then I would treat it as such. If it's just an expression, and I don't mean just, but if it's an expression made in the anguish of the moment, you may need to talk through that and deal with it. But that's all you can.
And so, have you seen people who've been able to go through or utilize different strategies to?
Oh yeah, I think as devastating as it is, as human beings, we sometimes have a resilience that even shocks us and surprises us, and happily, as difficult as it is, my sense is that most people do survive it.
And so is it just a matter of time? Is it a matter of laying in the mud?
Sometimes takes time. It's also, I think, a matter of trying to, of dealing with whatever issues you're struggling with. It's a matter. I think I always say grief is not just a matter of time; it's a matter of time and work. You're going to have to acknowledge your reactions, understand your reactions, find effective ways to cope with your reactions, get through the immediate shock. So time is a piece on that, but it's not just time. Time doesn't heal everything. We heal.
And so what are some healing strategies that you've seen to be effective in, I don't know, in particular to the sudden death of a child or in general?
Well, again, there's no magic in the field. For me, it would be an issue of trying to say, what's going on here? What is this person experiencing it? What are some of the factors that may be underlying it? For some people, it's just the ability to ventilate and to say what's on their mind and to explore it. Others may use different techniques. One technique that I've used sometimes with people is what's called, a variation of the empty chair technique. What's called by, I didn't develop it, Nancy Molez, among other people, have done some work with this, but it's a strategy that I've learned from them, called accessing the internalized other. This would be a situation where you would maybe speak to an empty chair and then sit in that chair and envision what that person might say to you. So for instance, this wasn't with the death of a child, but I used it very successfully a number of years ago with a young child about 14 years old whose father had died of cancer. In his last visit, he was about 11 when he visited his father for the last night, and and he was upset by his father's appearance, which was after a long bout with cancer, skeletal. And he was uncomfortable and he wanted to go home. And when he was trying to push his mother out, he also had a baseball game that night. His father said, "Well, give me one last hug." And he said, not tonight. We have to go, Dad. And of course, his father died overnight, and he felt terrible about that. And came into therapy a few years later. And I had him sit down, and and I said, "I want you to envision your father in that chair." And he started apologizing to him and crying about, why he didn't, hug him at that moment. And then what was remarkable about that is that soon after that happened, he took the chair himself. And he sat down and answered as he thought his father would answer, and he all of a sudden he turned, as he said, in his father's voice, and basically said, "Is that what's been bothering you, champ?" And he started laughing. He said, "That's exactly what my dad would have said to me. And he said, "I know you love me," and it was very, very healing for him. So, there are different strategies you use, but there's no silver. I always tell when I was teaching my graduate students in counseling, I'd always say there's no silver bullet. There's no, this works with everybody. Grief is extremely individual in our reactions, and we have to find the techniques that work with any given individual at that particular point in time.
Do you think that in this kind of traumatic loss of a child that going to therapy would be something that you'd say, to really work through that, therapy would be needed?
Well, I guess my answer to that would be, not everyone who experiences a loss necessarily needs therapy. And not even everybody who experiences the loss of a child, even the sudden loss of a child, necessarily needs therapy. Colin Murray Parks once wrote, I don't know if you know, Colin Murray Parks is really one of what I call the grandfather of grief studies. Still a man in his 90s, still producing, still, a wonderful contributor to the field, and someone I count as just a wonderful mentor and a wonderful resource. But Colin Murray Parks once wrote an article entitled "Grief Counseling: Who Needs It?" And his evidence-based conclusion was that the people who need grief counseling the most are the people who are either not getting support or not getting adequate support. So certainly, for example, and some people, as Bonanno's research say, are naturally resilient even to some of the worst situations. So I would say, that if the person, certainly some of the danger signs to me would be if you're basically chemical coping, or you're self-destructive or destructive of others, or want to kill somebody because your child died, or want to hurt yourself, or you're doing things that are harmful, like abusing substances, or you're really, after a period of time, still not functioning in major roles, work or school or whatever. Counseling would probably be important. But if you're getting support and you're coping well, not necessarily. I would say it doesn't hurt to check in with a counselor to see how you're doing, and and a good counselor will say, and I've said at times, you're just experiencing normal grief, and here are the danger signs, and and if you think you hit some of those, or if you want to explore this further, not every. I guess the message I want to get is not everybody needs counseling, but certainly that's one of the situations. With the death of a child, sudden or not sudden, is usually very traumatic, and certainly it puts a risk for more complicated grief. And if that complicated grief occurs, then certainly you'd want to seek counseling.
So could you tell the listeners the difference between complicated and uncomplicated grieving?
Yeah, well, I think what you see as complicated grieving is really where, over a period of time, and again, you really have impaired functioning. You're self-destructive. You're destructive of others. Those would be two clear signs. There are situations, and again, where grief becomes chronic or exaggerated, or is what we call masked by other things like alcoholism or something of that nature. Certainly, those are signs of complicated grief. Certainly, if you've had a history of mental issues, and the grief throws you into depression or severe anxiety reactions, or, those are all examples of complications that can occur in grief. Post-traumatic stress disorder would be another complication. There's a whole series of them, including some physical ones where the grief is actually affecting your health.
Can you give me an example of that?
Oh, well, I had a woman once who talked about the fact that she told me the story where she had considerable shaking in her hands, physically shaking in her hands, and the physician could find no particular reason, and then he found out she just had a recent loss. And he said to her, I think you should speak to a grief counselor. And so she came in to see me. He referred her to me. She came in to see me. She was furious. She said, her hands were shaking, almost like you'd see in a palsied kind of shaking mode. I wish I could demonstrate it, but can't do it on radio. And what would happen is, so she says, does this look like I'm crazy? He thinks I'm crazy. That was her interpretation of counseling, Mm-hmm. And I said, no, but let's sit down and talk for a minute. And I said, did you ever have that happen before in your life? And she said, when I was a little girl and I had tantrums, I would have this shaking. My parents and my brother told me, and and to me that was a flash. And I said, "Are you angry now?" And she thought about it, and she said, "Furious." And she talked about the events leading up to her husband's death and the anger and frustration she was feeling at the time. And literally, as she got that out, the shaking stopped. I always tell my class that's the most unusual, in terms of interventions, and most interventions don't occur as quickly or as affirmatively as that, but certainly that was a true story.
Wow, that's incredible. Did she continue with you, or did she say, "Okay, I'm done"?
Well, actually, after that, it really was almost a kind of one session kind of thing. What I always joke about is she later, talked about how brilliant her doctor was. But
you were
in the mirror and say, I'm confident enough to say, yeah, but you did okay too, Ken.
And so regular grieving, is there such a thing? Uncomplicated
Sometimes
grieving.
More typical grief reactions.
Yes. So that's to be expected with really any kind of loss, right? You can.
Yeah, and that can take on a range of different ways that we do it. Again, not everyone grieves in the same way, in the same manner, but yeah.
And so, from your 50 years in this field, what would you tell somebody is like 2 or 3 things that you've learned in working with people in grief?
Well, I think one of the things would be it is very, very individual. That we all grieve in our own way, in our own time. That even typical grief is a kind of roller coaster where you have ups and downs and highs and lows. I would say it's not just about feelings, grief, that we have all kinds of other reactions, physical reactions to it, cognitive reactions to it, behavioral reactions, spiritual reactions. Grief is the way we react to loss. And we do that in very individual ways.
Have you found that, like in your own life, that you go through a loss, does all of your training in insight help, or do you grieve the same way that us mere mortals do?
Okay. I think a student of mine really put that very, very nicely. She was one of those great students you love when you're teaching graduate students, love class, love to talk about the material, read it, kept in touch with everything. And when her brother died, and, knowing she was taking this course, one of her friends said, did it help? And she told me, she said, I thought about that for a long time before I answered, a while before I answered. And she said, it didn't make it any easier, was her response. It did make it more understandable. Mm-hmm. And I think that has been my response, would be my response as well. It doesn't mean you're immune from grief, but, a lot of times in grief what bothers people is this kind of sense like, am I going crazy? And a lot of times when they come into a counselor, they find, no, they're not going crazy. They're just having a normal reaction to their loss. But, they didn't expect it to take so long. They didn't expect it to be so tough. But they're just really grieving within the parameters of what we call normal grief. Mm-hmm. So my point would be that I don't know that it's any easier for people in the field. I do think, because we have the same complicated relationships in life as everybody else, but I do think that it is more understandable, and we don't ask that question, am I going crazy? Or at least we answer it, yeah, but so is everybody who's experiencing.
Right.
Right. And by the way, I have to say that I also think that being in the field for a long time has helped, in that I'm very conscious of the importance of time, and I'm very conscious of not leaving unfinished business. So if I have a 50-year-old son who lives close, and we don't argue very much now that he's older. But if we have issues, I'll try to deal with it at the time. I don't want to. When he was a little boy once, I never realized how nervous he sometimes got when I was, leaving home to do some speaking, and he was going to a babysitter.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And even though the babysitter was somebody, usually a friend's house, which he really enjoyed, it was still nerve-wracking, and I didn't always realize that. And one time, as I was trying to push him out the door, he said, I hope your plane crashes in anger. And I sat down and I laughed and I said, Michael, let's talk this through, because if anything happens to the plane, you'll spend years in therapy. And and he laughed at that, and we got through it. So I think I'm conscious of the issue of time. I always end my conversations with my family by, if we're away, I miss you and I love you. And, so I think it has made me more conscious of relationships, and in that way it has played a very positive role in my life.
Well, I know with my daughters, being, a psych nurse and then going into palliative care, I would have the same kinds of things with them, and, they'd say something, say, well, how do you feel about that? Or what do you think about that? Or there was a point when I got really, really sick and was intubated for a month, and I couldn't speak. And my daughter was, I don't know, 9th grade maybe, and in my very bad handwriting from, being so sick, I wrote to her and said, those times you told me to shut up, this didn't happen because of that. And she just read it and looked at me like, I didn't think that.
Yeah. I can remember 2 instances in my life. One is, I have a godson whose father died when he was just literally the day before his 4th birthday. So literally his last day of being 3 from cancer. Not the same kid I talked about, and he's my godson, so I've had a very significant role in his life in the years that followed, and I always would end every conversation with "I miss you" and "I love you," and one day what happened is that it was 9/11, and I was flying a lot in those days, so he called me up and left this wonderful little message that said, "Call me if you're on a plane." And then about 2 minutes later, he called back and left a message saying, "Just call me to let me know you're safe." I guess he thought it was a stupid message. Call me if you're on a plane.
Right.
And when I called him up, he was glad to hear I was around and alive. And he said it always used to drive me crazy when you would end conversations with "I miss you" and "I love you," and kind of, he'd kind of murmur, "Yeah, me too," or something like that, And and he said, "I realized why you did that today." He said, "I kept thinking that if you are on a plane and anything happened, at least I knew those were your last words to me."
Mm-hmm.
So, they can be very powerful. I think the study and the understanding of death can really change our lives in very positive ways.
I think so too, because we see death and deal with death so much, we're aware of the fragility of life.
Yeah.
We know that at any minute, literally, something can go south, and what are our last words to people?
Yeah.
I'm so very conscious of that, and I don't know if that makes my girls crazy or not, but I don't care. My last words to them, even though they might have royally annoyed me, is going to be that I love you, and that they won't have to. Maybe they will have to feel guilty. I don't know, but at least not to end conversations or your day or whatever it is with significant people in anger. Realize that that's going to be really hard to work through if something happens. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, and sometimes there's another side to that, which can also be kind of humorous at times. You know, I think sometimes we get very conscious on, you know, if you know, we gain a sense of perspective that not everyone we're around always shares when you're constantly involved in the field and studying death and dying. I remember one time when my son was about 17, he got into a small car accident, you know, young driver. And I was at school at the time, and he called me up, and I said, you know, are you okay? Was anybody else hurt? You know, was anybody in the car? And you know, it was a basic dent in a car. And he said, Dad, people don't have to die for it to be a problem.
Ooh. Man, that'd be a great T-shirt.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it?
It would. But I always remember that.
So what did he end up doing for work? Did he grow up to be a philosopher or something?
He's my son was always a business person. He works on Wall Street now. That's probably not terribly surprising if you knew him.
Well, tell him his T-shirt, his saying from 17, you know, age 17 would be a great T-shirt, I think.
Okay.
Any final words or ideas for our listeners who are, you know, literally struggling with
I
with
think
their
if I were going to summarize what we talked about and the topic, I would say, three things, I think. The death of a child in our society today is a terribly traumatic event. And, you know, it's important that you get support. And if you're not getting the support you need from the people immediately around you, then seek it. And I think I would say to a person who's maybe around that person, you know, validate and recognize the loss. This is a horrendous loss. We can't make it better. You know, often bereaved people will tell me the things that people say to help. You know, at least you have other children, you know, or something or, you know, if the child was sick for a long time, well, at least he or she is at peace. And these comments that try to minimize the loss really are often unhelpful. And I always remember there's a short little book that Erin Lynn, I don't even know if she's in the field anymore, wrote years and years ago, just a tiny little book called I Know Just How You Feel, Avoiding the Cliches of Grief. And she takes all of these common cliches, and this is what I teach people sometimes, and she does three things with them. She says, first of all, why did it hurt? And the reason it hurts is because it doesn't acknowledge our loss. You know, yeah, you have three other children, that's true, but you're mourning the child who did die, the fourth child. Mm-hmm. And then she says, why did they say it? And most of the time, most people aren't needlessly callous or cruel. They're trying to be helpful. And once we acknowledge that, even if it was a dumb statement, you know, we can recognize, yeah, they didn't mean to be mean on that. They just wanted to be helpful. And then the third thing that she says is, if somebody says that again to you, what can you say? You know, and she gives some examples, and I, you know, teach that to people to defend themselves when I'm counseling them. It may be, it's, you know, it certainly is a relief that I have three other children, but I will always miss Ann, or always miss Tony, or, you know, you're right, you know, Johnny's been sick for a long time, and it's been very difficult as he struggled with cancer, but that doesn't mean I miss him any less. Mm-hmm. You know, it's those kinds of comments you can give, which, you know, and I always say it's an unfair role when you're a grieving parent to sometimes educate those people around you. But sometimes we need to do that, and sometimes we need to know what kinds of support they can give. And so, for instance, you know, I one of my counseling techniques is I often ask people to write a list of their support system. And when they write their support system, I ask them to put a D next to people who are good doers, you're too upset to drive one of your kids to sports because of your loss. Maybe somebody else can do that. Or others who are good listeners, and others who are good respite, and that's important too. Grief is hard work, and sometimes we need people around us who will take us away from our grief, just like any hard work, We can go to a movie with them, we can go out to dinner with them. They're never going to say, I'm really worried about you, how are you doing? Because they hope against hope you don't talk about that. But that's their gift. Their gift is they give you time away.
Mm-hmm. I think another aspect to, when people kind of say things that aren't helpful is that once you kind of let them know that maybe that's hurtful, or you let them know, I got 3 other kids, but I still really miss this person. And if they keep doing it, you might need to take a respite from them. And there's sometimes that
I don't usually have people do this unless I sense it, the sense that it's there. There are some people who are just destructive in our lives, and we have to acknowledge that too and realize that. This is the person who says to you, I lost 20 pounds on my diet. Let's go out and get a good dessert, celebrate. Or, I'm 10 days sober. Let's have a beer, celebrate. There are destructive people. Hopefully they're rare in our lives, but sometimes we do find them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's also people who seem to attract those kinds of personalities into their lives too, which is a whole other set of issues. Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Doka, I really appreciate you talking with me today, and I think our listeners have received a wonderful gift from you. And I want to thank the people who are listening in for spending time with us during this show, Everyone Dies. You can read our blogs and listen to our other podcasts at everyonedies.org. That's EBERY, the number 1, DIES.org. Thank you to our producer, Jeannie White, our CEO, Lillian Caldwell. We produce a new show every Wednesday to answer questions related to life-threatening illness, dying, and death. You can email me if you have any suggestions for shows or any questions that you might have at Marianne, MARIANNE, at everyonedies.org. That's EBERY, the number 1 dies.org. I hope that you live your best life every day. And remember, every day is a gift. Thank you for listening. So we're talking with Ken Doka, and I have, this thing about Kublar Ross and people talking and asking about, well, what stage am I in? How long am I going to be in that stage? How does that work? And, if you've listened to our grief podcast, the way that I put it to you is that, Kublar Ross is kind of an old-fashioned framework. And so since I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Doka, the first thing I said was, Dr. Doka, tell me what you think about this. And so here he is.
Well, I think we have to recognize that Kublar Ross made 2 very significant contributions to the field. And the first is that she taught us to listen to dying patients and to talk to dying patients and not to be afraid to talk about the dying process with them. And you have to go back to the 60s when she was doing her work and wrote her book. And it was often a time when as one person put it, nobody died. And what we meant by that was not that nobody died, but, people would say somebody would be 80 pounds and lying in a bed and could barely lift their arm. And they'd say, doctor, what's going to happen? The person would say, I think in 4 months you'll be playing tennis, something when everybody knew that was not the case. And we often had this mutual pretense that everyone knew what was happening, but nobody was talking about it. So I think Kublar Ross was very important in helping us challenge that. She wasn't the first book on dying and death, but she was probably one of the early books that reached the bestseller list and that people got on. And I think her work had tremendous heuristic and historical value, that we look back on it. Remember, the book was published over 52 years ago.
Has it been that long?
What? 1969.
Jeez,
so clearly, it's no longer current. I always tell my students, you'd be very, very hesitant to go to an oncologist who last read an article or a book about treating cancer that was written in 1969. Certainly you wouldn't want to have a doctor who hasn't kept up for the last 51 years. So we have to make the same statements about Kublar Ross that are kind of difficult. That it is a different situation. It is a different circumstance now than it had been. And things have changed. People. It takes longer for people to die. People die less in hospitals. When I was 4 years old, I broke my arm. I spent months in a hospital. Now, if
really?
Yeah, because I needed 4 operations. So I was in there for not months, but probably a good 3 or 4 weeks. Where now, if I spent 3 nights, it'd probably be a lot.
Yeah.
So the treatment of people was different. We're talking, remember, I'm 73, so we're talking 69 years ago. We also have to remember that Kublar Ross wrote about coping with dying, and I still think it's a simplistic model for that. But again, it was even later applied to grief. So we have to say the book had some importance. But and certainly, I used to require my students to read it just because of its historical reasons. But we no longer really think that people either die or grieve in some kind of stage-like process. We know we have multiple reactions, not just feelings, but physical reactions when we grieve, behavioral reactions, cognitive, spiritual. Probably the best advice that I would give to my students is that people die and grieve as they live. And and look, I had a professor once who said, look at the way you handle crises, and that's how you'll handle crises, barring some sudden insights or late life therapy. That'll be the way you will deal with crises at the end of life. If you're very stoic, I'd expect stoicism. I deal with things like often by writing. My colleagues often joke that I don't have many unpublished thoughts. But the reason for that is it's a way for me to work out issues, that bother me. I write about them, and that helps me understand them. So I would expect that, hopefully not for a few years, maybe a decade or two, you might see articles by me saying a thanatologist copes with his own diagnosis, or but we all die and grieve as we live, and again, stage models are just too simplistic, really. And again, it's also important to remember that Kublar Ross's model of the dying process was impressionistic. It wasn't based on data, and even she hesitated later on by saying, well, it's not really meant to be linear, and it's not really meant to be this, although it sounds like it. It certainly does when you talk about stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, all those stages. So again, it's an important theory to understand for historical reasons, but it's no longer one of the current models that we have in either the understanding of dying or the understanding of grief.
So are there the current ones, are there any of them that are linear?
No, most of them, for instance, one of the common models of the dying process, of the grieving process, is by William Worden. And Worden talks about what he calls tasks, that he says that, there are certain kinds of issues that grieving people have to struggle with. And they don't struggle with them in any particular order, and they struggle with them in their own unique way. But, for instance, adjusting to a life without the person, dealing with your emotions about the person, reconstructing beliefs. that have been challenged by the loss, maintaining, figuring out how to maintain. One of the new theories of understandings of grief is that we never lose a bond with the person who died. They're always part of our memory and part of our biography, and we may have spiritual connections with them, whatever our spirituality is. So Worden's task model is one model in the grieving process, and then another very common model is the model by two researchers in the Netherlands, Hank Strobe and Hank Schutt and Maggie Strobe. I got that mixed up for a minute, and they talk about in similar terms that in grieving we oscillate, or we move between what they call the dual process theory. We move between adjusting to a life without the person, and then having to deal with a loss. So, just to give you an example of that, I had a woman client who came into me one day, very, very proud that she had balanced the checkbook for the first time since her husband's death. That had been his traditional task. Mm-hmm. But then when she came back the next week, she said, when I left your office, I realized if John were still alive, I wouldn't have had to worry about that. So it's that oscillating, that moving back and forth among these two processes, living a life in the face of the loss and dealing with the loss itself. Mm-hmm. That are more current understandings of the grieving process.
And I think it's good for our listeners to know that it's such a very fluid, in the very beginning it can be from one minute to the other, going back and forth between these emotions, and that there's other things that can trigger or set off the loss or make you more aware of this person isn't in your life or what that relationship was. And what I hear patients say and people, other people say is that I want to stop feeling like this.
Yeah, and the answer for most people is over time. You will, but there will always be surges of grief that we have, even later in life. It may be the 10-year-old girl who 20 years later is getting married and walking down the aisle, and she misses the fact that her father is not there with her, or or 30 years down the line when her child graduates from high school or something like that. That grandpa couldn't see this, or grandma couldn't see that, or my spouse didn't live to see this. And that's a very normal part of grieving too. And that's part of that continuing bond.
And I think that's hard for people. They want to be able to say, she's dead. I've buried her. I've grieved her, and now I'm going on with my life. And so when that grief comes back, it's sort of like, what the heck is this?
Yeah, but what I always do is when I counsel people, I talk about and we talk about when these surges might occur. And it's interesting because one of the things that I also do at the very beginning when somebody comes into therapy is I ask them what they're expecting, and many times they say something just like you said. I guess I want to move on. I guess I want to detach. I guess I'm supposed to get closure. I always tell my students, bring closure to the word closure. Not a word we should use in the field. And I always say, is that what you really want? I challenge that. And they say, well, I never want to forget him. I never want to stop thinking about her. And then you say, and I usually tell people the first sign that they're doing better in grief is that they're able to laugh about a story that was once much too painful to recall. It's not about giving up memories. It's not about giving up connections. It's that those bonds are going to continue, but finding ways to continue those bonds without your presence, without the physical presence of the person. And one of the things that's that's important about that is to recognize that sometimes there may be moments where those bonds hurt at times. But, most people would rather have them than not have any at all, as I look at my, aging family, my grandson now is going off to college next year. My granddaughter's in high school, It's that, I don't want my family to forget me, and I certainly don't want my son to forget his grandfather and his grandmother with whom he was very close to, and they have no intention of doing that.
Well, and I think that part of our job as the parents is to be inclusive in terms of talking about the people who died, to let the kids know these people are part of our life.
Yeah. What we do is the first 3 ornaments, we do a little, we have a big open house around Christmas, but before that we have a little family occasion where we decorate the Christmas tree prior to that. And the first 3 ornaments we put on are memorial ornaments to my parents, their grandparents, and then to my my godson's dad.
Ah, that's a nice tradition.
Yeah, it is.
And then do they talk about those people, or is it just...
we don't push a conversation, but sometimes they'll ask questions, and sometimes conversations will inevitably start. But, it's just a way of saying, yeah, they're part of our holiday, and we can talk about them if we wish to.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, have we put Kublar Ross to bed or not?
I hope so.
Well, thank you, Dr. Doka, for taking some of your precious time to talk with me and to share your wisdom with our listeners.
I so much enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to become a talk show host? Do you have a great idea? Passionate World Talk Radio is currently looking for podcast hosts for our Internet Talk radio station. Please email us at pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com with your name, email address, cell phone number, and podcast topic. In return, you will receive a 3-minute intro on air to a live audience about your podcast. Remember, just email us your name, email address, and your podcast topic, and in return, you will receive a free 3-minute intro on the air. How cool is that? Thank you for listening to Passionate World Talk Radio. You can listen to this program all over again by going over to https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. You can also hear it on Spotify, Spreaker, Amazon ALEXA, AMFM247.com every Tuesday evening between 8 and 9 p.m. YouTube, Facebook, Facebook Live, LinkedIn, and all the other podcast directories one can find on the Internet.